There's a liquid probably already sitting in your kitchen that works through the same biological pathway as ibuprofen, one of the most widely used anti-inflammatory drugs on the planet, and it's tied to a hormone that plays a real role in stubborn belly fat. But most of what's sitting in supermarket bottles right now has almost none of the compound that actually does this work, which means a lot of people are already doing the right thing with the wrong bottle. Over the next several minutes, I'll walk through exactly what that compound is, why it connects to cortisol and belly fat specifically, the actual research behind it, the mistake that quietly cancels out the effect for most people, and a simple way to check what's already in your kitchen tonight. I'm Joshua Smith, and if you want the plain language version of health research without the fluff, subscribe so more of this finds you. The story behind this starts with a researcher named Gary Beauchamp, a biologist at the Monell Chemical Senses Center in Philadelphia. In 2005, while tasting freshly pressed olive oil at a food science event in Sicily, he noticed something strange, a sharp, peppery sting at the back of his throat that felt oddly familiar. He'd felt that exact sensation before, during earlier research on liquid ibuprofen, which produces a similar throat sting. That connection sent him and his team back to the lab, and what they found was significant enough to be published in the journal Nature. Fresh extra virgin olive oil contains a compound they named Oleocanthal, built from the words for olive, sting, and its chemical structure. And that peppery burn isn't a flaw in the oil, it's the compound itself doing something measurable. A follow-up study from the same research group actually tracked down why the burn happens where it does. There's a specific receptor called TRPA1 concentrated right at the back of the throat, and it's the same receptor responsible for triggering a protective cough reflex against inhaled irritants. Oleocanthal activates that receptor directly, which is the actual physical reason you feel it exactly where you feel it, and not somewhere else. Here's what oleocanthal actually does once it's past your throat. Your body has two enzymes called COX1 and COX2. Think of them as alarm switches that, when activated, ramp up inflammation throughout your system. Ibuprofen works by blocking those switches so the alarm can't fully sound. Oleocanthal does something remarkably similar, blocking the same enzymes through a completely different chemical door. Even though the two compounds don't look anything alike structurally, one's a pharmaceutical, the other's a plant compound that happens to hit the same biological target. It's not as strong as an actual dose of ibuprofen. Researchers have estimated a large daily serving of high-quality olive oil provides an anti-inflammatory effect somewhere in the range of a tenth of a standard ibuprofen dose. But it's a real, measurable, natural version of the same mechanism, with none of the stomach or kidney concerns that come with regular NSAID use, since you're not taking anywhere near a pharmaceutical dose. Worth mentioning briefly, oleocanthal's research interest hasn't stayed confined to inflammation. It's drawn attention in other areas of study too, including some early research into neurodegenerative disease and cancer biology, though that work is considerably earlier stage and shouldn't be read as an established treatment for either. It's worth knowing mainly because it makes the point that this isn't a compound getting attention for one narrow reason. It's one researchers keep circling back to across a few different fields. So where does cortisol fit into this? Chronic low-grade inflammation is one of several things that can keep your body's stress response running hotter than it should, and cortisol is the hormone at the center of that response. Fat cells in the abdominal area specifically do carry a higher density of cortisol receptors than fat cells elsewhere in the body, and abdominal fat tissue also has more of an enzyme that locally converts inactive cortisone into active cortisol right at the fat cell itself, essentially generating its own local supply on top of whatever's circulating in your bloodstream. That combination is part of why chronically elevated cortisol tends to preferentially direct fat storage toward the midsection, rather than spreading it evenly across the body. There's a reasonable evolutionary explanation offered for why the body would prioritize that in the first place. Cortisol's core job, going back long before modern chronic stress existed, was mobilizing quick energy during short bursts of real physical danger, and fat stored centrally, close to the liver and major blood vessels, is more readily accessible for that kind of rapid mobilization than fat stored in the arms or legs. The problem in modern life is that the stress response gets triggered constantly by things that aren't physical threats at all: work pressure, poor sleep, ongoing low-grade inflammation, so that same efficient storage system stays switched on indefinitely instead of being used and then switched back off. It's worth being honest that this is a genuinely complex hormonal system, with a lot of contributing factors: sleep, stress, overall diet, activity level, not a single clean switch that one compound flips on its own. But reducing a source of chronic inflammation is one legitimate lever in that system, and it's the one Oleocanthal is positioned to help with. This isn't purely theoretical. The largest and most well-known piece of human evidence here comes from a study called PREDIMED, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, following over 7,000 adults at high cardiovascular risk for close to 5 years. Participants were split into 3 groups, one following a Mediterranean diet supplemented with free extra virgin olive oil, about a liter a week, one following a Mediterranean diet supplemented with mixed nuts instead, and a control group simply advised to eat a low-fat diet. The group getting the olive oil had roughly a 30% lower rate of heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death compared to that low-fat control group. Worth knowing, since it adds to the credibility rather than taking away from it, the original 2013 version of this study was later corrected for an issue with how a few study sites handled randomization, and republished in 2018 with the same essential finding intact, which is actually a fairly rare and reassuring thing to see happen with a major study. Chronic inflammation was one of the mechanisms researchers pointed to in explaining that protective effect, the same inflammation that keeps cortisol elevated and belly fat locked in place. It's worth pointing out why extra virgin specifically, and not just olive oil generally, keeps showing up as the variable that matters in this research. The Mediterranean diet gets credited with a lot of health benefits broadly, but when researchers have specifically compared higher polyphenol extra virgin oil against more refined, lower polyphenol versions within Mediterranean-style eating patterns, the higher polyphenol version tends to come out ahead on the inflammatory and cardiovascular measures researchers actually track. That's consistent with Oleocanthal, and the broader family of polyphenols alongside it, being a meaningful part of why this specific food shows up so consistently in the research, rather than just standing in for eating more healthy fat in general. Now here's the mistake almost everyone makes, the reason a lot of people use olive oil daily and never notice a difference. Oleocanthal isn't stable. It's a polyphenol, and polyphenols are chemically reactive compounds that break down through oxidation when they're exposed to heat, light, or air over an extended period. The same basic process that turns a cut apple brown or makes an old rubber band brittle. The moment olive oil leaves the mill, that clock starts running. Picture a freshly printed newspaper left in direct sunlight, readable on day 1, faded and hard to make out after a week outside. That's roughly what happens to a lot of the olive oil sitting on supermarket shelves in clear bottles under fluorescent lighting for months at a time before it ever reaches your cart. By the time it reaches your plate, much of what made it worth using in the first place is already gone, even though nothing about how it looks or smells necessarily tips you off. So here's what actually matters when you're choosing a bottle. Look for cold-pressed and extra virgin specifically on the label, not light olive oil or pure olive oil, both of which go through refining that strips out the polyphenols entirely, sometimes using heat or chemical processing that a truly cold-pressed extra virgin oil never sees. Look for a harvest date, not just a best before date. A harvest date tells you how recently the oil was actually pressed, since oleocanthal content is highest in the first year after harvest and only declines from there, while a best before date can be set years out, regardless of how degraded the oil already is. Harvest timing itself matters too, separate from freshness. Olives picked earlier in the season, while still green, tend to produce oil with a more bitter, more peppery profile and meaningfully higher polyphenol content, oleocanthal included, compared to oil from olives left to ripen longer, which produces a milder, smoother oil with less of that sting. Neither is wrong exactly, they're just different products with different trade-offs, but if the peppery burn is specifically what you're after, an early harvest oil is generally the safer bet. And choose a dark glass bottle over a clear one, since light exposure is one of the main things degrading the compound over time, and a dark bottle is specifically designed to slow that down. Once you've opened a bottle, keep it somewhere cool and away from direct light rather than next to the stove, which is exactly where a lot of kitchens end up storing it out of habit. Here's a rough, informal way to check what you already have. Take a small spoonful straight, no food. If you feel a genuine peppery sting or burn at the back of your throat, sometimes it even triggers a small cough. That's a reasonable sign there's meaningful oleocanthal present. If it just tastes smooth and buttery with no bite at all, it's likely low in polyphenols, whatever the label claims. This isn't a precise measurement. Lab testing is the only way to get an actual number, but it's a decent gut check you can do tonight with a bottle you already own. Worth doing this with more than one bottle if you have them, since it's common to own a couple, maybe a cheaper one for everyday cooking and a nicer one for special occasions, and the result can genuinely surprise you. Price doesn't reliably predict which one wins that comparison either, since polyphenol content comes down more to freshness and harvest timing than to what the bottle cost. On amount, the research generally lines up with somewhere around 2 to 4 tablespoons of high-quality, cold-pressed extra virgin olive oil daily, which is also roughly what the Mediterranean diet study used per person. Worth being upfront, 4 tablespoons is around 400 to 500 calories of fat, so the practical way to use this is as a swap, replacing the oils and dressings you're already using, not pouring it on top of your existing meals as an add-on. Individual polyphenol content also varies quite a bit bottle to bottle, so someone using a genuinely high phenolic oil may get meaningful benefit from the lower end of that range, while a milder oil might need more to deliver the same amount. Oleocanthal holds up reasonably well to heat compared to some other polyphenols, but prolonged high heat still degrades it over time, so using it raw, drizzled on at the end of cooking rather than as the oil you fry in, preserves more of it. On timing, to be straightforward about what actually happens and when, the COX inhibiting effect itself starts working within hours of that first tablespoon, so something genuinely happens the same day you start. But the cortisol and belly fat piece isn't an overnight change. That part is cumulative, building through consistent daily use as chronic inflammation gradually comes down over weeks rather than days. Most of the research showing measurable shifts in inflammatory markers from dietary polyphenols looks at intervals of a month or more, not single servings. So treat this as a daily habit you're building toward a slow, compounding effect rather than a fix you'll notice by tomorrow morning. To recap, the compound is oleocanthal. It works through the same anti-inflammatory pathway as ibuprofen at a fraction of the strength. It's tied to real research connecting inflammation, cortisol, and where your body tends to store fat, and it's genuinely present in olive oil, just not in most of what's sitting on a supermarket shelf under fluorescent lights. Look for cold-pressed extra virgin, a harvest date, and a dark bottle. Store it away from heat and light once it's open. Use 2 to 4 tablespoons daily as a swap rather than an add-on. And give it weeks, not days, to actually show up. If this was useful, subscribing helps more people find it. I'm Joshua Smith, and I'll see you in the next one.